There was a link to this in terms of contemporary ops, and that in '03, when the book came out and made a bit of a splash in the UK, a gentleman named Richard Iron did a review of it for the British Army Review. And one of the core things he talked about was the ability of this army to adapt not just to jungle warfare, which I'll get into, but actually adapt to war. The full spectrum itself was a key thing to try to understand, and he hoped that the British Army at the time, as we're facing the war in Iraq and later Afghanistan, could actually have the same level of professionalism to go deep and hard and critically look at itself and say where you failed and then try to fix the problems. So ironically, that book kind of kicked off all the time I do downrange, because that's what I do. I looked at various units, formations, and cultures of the U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Army, British Army, and how we adapted to the conflict in both Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's learning and adaptation, as well as ongoing professionalism at a time of major expansion, became the cornerstone of the Indian Army by 1944. Why do I say this? This was an army that was 200,000 in 1939, but by 1945 was the largest volunteer army the world has ever seen, 2.5 million, all volunteers. It was an army that was thoroughly defeated by the Imperial Japanese Army in '42, but by June '45, it inflicted one of the worst land defeats upon the Imperial Japanese Army. This army debated fundamental issues before the losses of 1942 and continued the debates of why it had been defeated after the first Burma Campaign in 1942. It was a tactical and organizational reform process that began bottom up, but would be joined by the top, meaning GHQ India, by the summer of 1943. In the end, the future 14th Army was not just a jungle army, but a professional army that could fight in the jungle, open plains of Burma, understood combined arms, but it was also capable of air landing and amphibious operations, full spectrum. As I said, in 1939, the Army was 200,000 men. So I'll get into the expansion issue. Why is this important? Because all the armies in the West, in terms of the US, UK, and Australia, are thinking about issues of mobilization again. If the balloon goes up in Asia or a balloon goes up in Europe, how do these armies deal with expansion? How do you work from a professional force and then expand? Sadly, in 1939, when the Viceroy in India called London and said, "We're ready to expand the Army," London said, "Not needed. We don't need the Indian Army to expand. We'll be fine with just the British Army." Forgetting, of course, what happened in World War I. After the Italian entry into the war, of course, they asked the Indians to expand. 12 new divisions will be raised within 18 months. Officers, NCOs, Viceroy Commission officers were milked, meaning that you took the regulars, you try to spread them out through all these new formations, you get a battalion ready to go, you break up that battalion, create another battalion. So certain regiments would have close to 25 battalions by 1942 and 43, whereas they stood at only 5 battalions in 1939. There will be a drop. There will be a drop of professionalism, there will be a drop of capability. But war actually pushes forces to actually go to war well before they're ready.